All right, I am going to get us kicked off here. So, all right, thanks for joining everyone. We're here to talk about emission rates and metrics for electric sector planning. Pieter Gagnon from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. I work in a group here that we study the possible evolution of the US power sector and try to build tools and data and other stuff to help people with planning and technology evaluation and other similar questions. So just very quickly, housekeeping, if you have comments, there should be a little chat box that you have there. Feel free to drop anything in there. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A, the little Q&A box there. And note also that you can upvote other people's questions. So if you have that panel open and someone asks something that you want to have answered, go ahead and hit the little up button. And then we'll try to answer the critical ones throughout, but we'll probably keep most of it to the end. One of my colleagues, Matt Irish, and then Jess will also be helping with kind of managing things. So not the only one here. And then we also are going to be recording and making the slide deck available at the link here. I think Matt was going to drop that into the Q&A or chat box. So anyway, that housekeeping aside, what are we here for? Agenda. Most of the time, this first thing that we're going to talk about is a recent study that we've done at NREL. This paper that I've got on the right side, planning for the evolution of the electric grid with a long-run marginal emission rate. I'm going to spend most of our time talking about what we did in that study, the conclusions, what we learned from it, etc. After we're done with that, we are going to talk a little bit about a publicly available database, the Cambium database that we have. What the issues in the study, we're talking about some problems and opportunities, but this isn't one of those things where we just talk about problems and there's nothing to act on. There is anything that what we're talking about during the first portion, there's data available to help support action, and we'll bring that up at the end. And then we'll end with some Q&A and just try to have some discussion going if questions came in. So, what is the point of this talk? Why are we here? The question that we're trying to answer, the kind of big picture here is this question. What metric is most suitable for estimating the emission consequences of an electric sector intervention? It's a mouthful, but really is just saying if you are considering an intervention, something that will change electric load, what number do you use to estimate the emissions that will be either induced or avoided by that intervention? Very common thing, this is the general way of saying it, but just to have something a little more clear in mind, a couple of examples. If you're thinking about a heat pump, you're saying if you install a heat pump, you know what electricity is going to be consumed, but what are the electric sector emissions induced by that new electrical load? If you're looking the other direction and you're thinking about an energy efficiency measure for either a house or a city, if you're decreasing electricity consumption, how can you estimate what emissions will be avoided by that electricity decrease? Or things like operational strategies of electric vehicles or other dispatchable loads. What are the emissions differences from charging your electric vehicle during the day versus the night? That kind of stuff. This all falls under the category of things where you have a good idea of how electricity consumption will change, and you want to know how that will influence emissions. Here we're talking about greenhouse gas emissions, specifically carbon from combustion, but the concepts that we're applying here apply to other emissions types as well. We won't really get into that, but just wanted to clarify up front. So I say what type of metric? I'm guessing that most of you probably have some intuition that there are different types of metrics out there, emission rates, different types of emission rates. But if not, the three that we are going to be looking at, the three families of emission rates that we will be looking at for this study are here on the screen. We have average emission rates, and then we have two different types of marginal emission rates, short-run marginal and long-run marginal. Each one of these, there's like different ways to calculate them. There's actually some nuance within these families, but we don't need to worry about that for the purpose of this study. These are just the broad categories are sufficient to kind of get the points that we're trying to make here. So to walk through this quick, average emission rates, super simple. This is the really obvious one. You just take all of the generation, everything that's on at some point in time in a given region, and you sum it all up, and then you take the average emission rate of all the different generators that were on at some time. So you can go to, for example, the eGrid database, the EPA database, great database. It just describes retrospectively, for example, all the different generation that happened in Colorado in 2020, and then it's just the average emission rate of that. So one option is that if you want to know what emissions will be induced or avoided by something new, you can just take the average of what we've done in the past and use that to estimate what will happen if you change things going forward. Very reasonable thing to try. We want to see how well that performs. But there's also two different ways of looking at things. You're not just taking and describing what's been happening in the past. Those are marginal emission rates. One thing is that if you folks are familiar with this space and you've heard the term just marginal emission rate without a prefix, you've almost certainly been hearing about the short run marginal. People don't specify it usually, but if they just say marginal emission rate, they're almost always talking about the short run marginal. And the difference between these two, starting with the short run, is the marginal emission rate. It's the emission rate of the next unit of electricity, but the short run considers the structure of the grid as fixed. What I mean by structure is the generators, wind, solar, natural gas plants, all that stuff, as well as things like transmission lines, stuff like that, all the capital assets. So this is saying, if I turn on my space heater, just from the grid as it exists today, what is the emission rate that would be induced by that? Not looking at what would be built, but just saying operationally, you got to serve another thing. What is the emission rate that would serve that new load? There's a bunch of data sources for this. The EPA puts out this AVERT tool, great tool built on the empirical data that we have about the historical operation of the power sector, and then projects again this thing. If you asked for another unit of power from the grid, what would it most likely come from? And then there's also a bunch of private companies that are calculating these things. They all have their own proprietary methods. They're trying to do it, a lot of them in real time, stuff like that. Things like watt time, surety, electricity map, Carbonera. I don't mean to pick favorites. There's other ones too. The point is there's a lot of different data sources for this. Anyway, not going to talk about other people's products here. We're just focusing on what we did for this paper. Just wanted to make sure you knew that stuff was out there. Now, short run marginal emission rate is different from long run marginal emission rate, and it's crucial for understanding this paper. Long run marginal emission rate, same concept. It's the emission rate of the next unit of electricity. However, it takes into consideration how the grid might structurally adapt to the intervention that you're studying. It doesn't consider the capital assets of the grid fixed, it considers them variable. That sounds a bit wonky, but really all it means is that, for example, if you added a bunch of electric load during daylight hours, then there is a possibility that you would induce more photovoltaic solar electricity to be built. And built is the important part here. It's a structural change. If you demand more electricity in times that renewable, like wind and solar generators are able to provide low-cost electricity, then our models would say is it reasonable to expect that new generators of those types would be built. And if you want to understand the full consequences of your actions, that you would want to take that into account. So there's both the operational impact plus possible structural impacts. That's what's different about short run and long run. Short run ignores the structural part, treats things as fixed, and talks about what the next unit of electricity, the emission rate would be, whereas the long run stuff treats the capital assets as variable. To be clear, they both have different purposes. We're going to be kind of looking at one specific application here, but we'll talk a little bit about how these actually can be combined for different purposes at the end of this talk. There's less data sources for this. It's hard to calculate. We have this Cambium data set. We'll talk about it at the end of the talk, where you can go and get long-run marginal emission rate projected data. We're not the only ones doing it though. The CPUC in California has some long-run marginal emission rates, and avoided cost calculator, stuff like that. Other people are doing this work too, but it's less than the short-run stuff. Anyway, that was a lot. Hopefully that makes some sense. I do want to just toss this out here. It's not going to be critical to the rest of our talk, but it is helpful if you care about this stuff and you don't know these words that just popped on screen. Average emission rates would be considered attributional. They're descriptive. It's a way of essentially describing the current state of the world and gaining an understanding and informing decisions based off of a particular attributional framework. Whereas the other two you'd categorize them as consequential framework emission rates. If you aren't familiar with this type of stuff, but you're interested in this general idea of like selecting different emission rates for different purposes, I highly recommend that you Google those terms and do some reading. There's a lot of great stuff about there. I'm not going to use this going forward in this talk. I just wanted to get it out there because categorizing what emission rates are useful for different purposes is becoming increasingly important as there's a proliferation of different ones that people are calculating like us. Okay, we are here to take those three metric families that I just talked about and try to figure out which one is the best for that question that I led with, trying to understand the emission consequences of different interventions. So how did we do that? How did we test a metric? The method here, I'm going to run through this, I'm going to go through this here relatively quickly. If you really want to get into the details of how this was done, you got to go read the paper, but I want to at least give you a sense of this. If this doesn't make sense, like if you're not that familiar with our power sector models, it's fine. The results are fairly intuitive, but I got to run through this so people have at least a sense of what we did. So real quick, I'm going to give a highlight then and a step through each of these. The basic idea is that we first calculated each one of these metrics. We're going to test them. We got to calculate them, of course, using the power system models that we have here at NREL. Then we defined a bunch of different load shapes, like adding load only during the day or across all hours of the day or only during the night, that sort of thing. We want to see which metric can calculate and understand and anticipate the difference between these different types of load shapes. Then we used each metric to estimate the emissions that are induced by each load shape. That's what we're here to do, right? You're trying to understand what happens if you add a bunch of load during the day. So you use a metric to estimate a particular load shape, and you get a number. Then we take the load shape, again, these different load shapes that we defined, and we directly plug them into our models and run the models. So we're not estimating with these metrics anymore. We're just directly plugging different loads in the models and then running them over a 20-year period and seeing what happens. Then we compare these two values. We have the full modeled value and we have the estimated values, and we compare those two things. So that's the high level thing. I don't know if it was helpful to run through that, but I'm going to go through each of those steps in a little bit more detail now. Again, if this is a lot, it's fine. The results coming up in 5 minutes are going to be, I hope, fairly intuitive, but I do want to give you a flavor of what this stuff looks like. So the first step that I mentioned was we calculate each of the metrics using the power sector models that we have here at NREL. So that results in what we have here. These heat maps, these are hourly values for a year for each of the three different metrics. The top is the average emission rate, the middle is the short run marginal, and the bottom is the long run marginal emission rate. So you can see each of them is quite a bit different. To clarify, this is the study that we did looked at the nation as a whole. You can obviously do this for smaller regions. We just, for this purpose of the study, did the whole nation. That creates a lot of kind of smoothing effects. There's a lot of interesting stuff that happens to the local level. That wasn't the point of this paper. So just be aware that we're talking about the whole nation when we're talking about this. Anyway, I'm not going to go into the detail of how we calculated each of these, mostly because I don't have the time. But again, the average emission rate, super simple. We're just taking each hour and we're summing up all the different generation. We're saying, what is the average emission rate of the coal, natural gas, wind, and solar, and everything else that was on at any particular point in time. The short run marginal emission rate looks and says for a particular grid, what is that unit that's at the operational margin? If you asked for just another incremental little bit of power, what is the emission rate of the generator that would serve that? The long run marginal emission rate, we go and we actually calculate, or we project out how the grid could evolve. This is a little, don't take this too seriously. It's just trying to get the idea in your head that we're projecting forward the evolution of the grid. And then we have this complicated process. Again, I wish I could get into the details of this. It's super interesting, but it's not the point of this talk right here. We run the model normally, then we run it with essentially a prototypical intervention, and we look at how what emissions were induced by this intervention, and we roll it all back into this representative value here. It is important how you calculate these metrics, but again, we don't have time to get into it here. The point is just that we use our power sector models to project this heat map here of the rate that emissions would be induced at different times of the day. based on what our models would say would be the type of generation that would serve increase or decrease in load. Anyway, so we calculate these three different metrics. Then we want to test their ability to estimate the emissions induced by different load shapes. I just have some examples here. We had 31 different load shapes. They're different things like add in load during the daytime, add in load during the night, add in load during the daytime, but then ramping down to other hours. A bunch of different things like that. Not going to show them all, just wanted to get a general sense that we have different load shapes here, different times of day the load is being added. Then we take those metrics that we calculated in the first step, and we just multiply them by the different load shapes. It's a load weighted average thing. It's a little complicated, doesn't really matter. But the point is, I think this is just, if you've ever taken a electricity number and multiply it by like an e-grid emission rate, that's all we're talking about here. You just say we're taking the change in load, multiplying it by this metric, and we get an estimate of the emissions that would be induced or avoided by this intervention. So you get a number, something like here for this particular one was 284 kilograms of CO2 per megawatt hour for this particular load. That's the estimated value. This metric estimated that value. Then we want to get something that is not an estimate. It's still a modeled value. I want to be clear. We're projecting out in the future. We have to use models, but we're actually directly plugging in this unique load shape into our power sector model. Reads, that's this thing that projects how the grid would adapt to the intervention over time, both operationally and structurally. And you get a number out of that. You put it in the model, you run it out for 20 years, and you compare the intervention with the model run with and without the intervention, and you get a value. We're taking this as our ground truth. It's not actually a ground truth. It's not something we observed in reality because it's projecting the future. But the point is that this is what we're comparing against. The ability of the metric to be able to anticipate this number is how we're judging quality, which is what we do in the last step. We say the metric had one number, 284 in this case. The full model had a different number. And the better that the metric could anticipate what the full model did, the better we would consider the metric. Anyway, hopefully that made sense. If not, it's fine. The next steps are I don't know, hopefully will still make sense. We're going to be looking at, this is basically the figure that we're going to spend the rest of our time on. So we're going to spend a lot of time walking through and making sure that you know what you're looking at here. This is the figure that we're going to use to try to understand how each of the three different metrics, average emission rates, and then short run and long run marginal emission rates, performed. It's a parity plot. So on the bottom, we have these observed emission rates. This is what came out of the full explicit modeling of each of the different load shapes. And then on the y-axis here, we have the estimated carbon emission rates. This is what the metrics had. A well-performing metric will have all of its points fall on this parity line. So to start with, oh yes, of course, I want to just throw this in here. Basically, good to fall on the line. If you're above the line, you're overestimating. The metric tends to overestimate. If you're below it, underestimates. You don't really need to keep that in your head. The point is just deviation from the lines are not good. They're an underperformance of the metric. So first results. Sorry it took so long to get here. Short run marginal emission rate. First reaction, I'm going to kind of walk through what exactly we're looking at here, but it's certainly by that criteria I just set up, which is that the metrics points should be falling on this line, is not performing well. So again, just to kind of walk through what we're looking at here, each one of these dots is a different load shape. So there's 31 different load shapes. There's 31 different dots here. They're adding load at different times of day. You can't tell from this figure, but the ones that are on the kind of left side here with the observed emission rates, we plugged them into the model and ran the model, the reads model out fully, tend to be loads that are adding load during daylight hours. Whereas the ones here on the right side with the higher observed values tend to be adding load during the nighttime. And then the middle ones are adding load across all different hours of the day. So we see that there is actually a very wide range at which emissions are induced by the different interventions that we're looking at here. All the way, there's one that's negative, we'll talk about that later, but for the most part, it's all the way from 0 all the way up to 600. The short run marginal emission rate, however, estimated, if you had used the metric as it's typically calculated, there's lots of different ways of calculating it, but the way that we replicated it in this study tends to significantly overestimate the emissions induced by the intervention. It also did not do a good job of telling the difference between different diurnal trends. It wasn't really able to differentiate the difference between adding load during the day versus during the night, that sort of thing. So what's happening here? Why did this perform so poorly? For that, we're going to look at one point here. So this point here, this load, added load across all hours of the day, just the middle one that just decided to pick out here for us to kind of walk through what's happening here to better understand why this metric did not perform well. And we're going to do that by looking at the generation mixtures that were actually induced in our model when we ran this intervention out, versus what the short-run marginal emission rate implicitly assumed the induced generation was going to be. And what you can see here, so that we have this observed mixture. This is what happened when we ran it in the model. There is a mixture here that has the black is coal, the purple is natural gas. There's this other, which includes things like geothermal, landfill gas, biomass, and a handful of other things. And then there's a chunk of the green, which is wind and solar. This is saying that when we added this load across all hours of the day, it got more things were built, more wind and solar were built, and that's being recognized by the mixture of generation that was induced by this intervention. When we look, however, at the mixture that the short-run marginal emission rate implicitly assumed, it was predominantly coal and natural gas. And that's because if you can't recognize structural responses to an intervention, then you aren't going to be able to fully capture how wind and solar could contribute to additional electric demand, because you have to build more stuff of that in order to get more of it. I shouldn't say that. You can have curtailment and you can recover if you have too much solar in an hour, you can recover that otherwise curtailed energy, and that'll show up operationally. And that's actually here. It's this little teeny sliver. You can barely see it. In places that had more curtailment, that little sliver might be higher, and the short-run marginal emission rate might perform well. But in the modeling that we did, this nationwide analysis, in the future that we were projecting, curtailment was not significant enough to show up a great deal in the estimated mixtures of the short-run marginal emission rate. Anyway, I'm getting too much into the weeds here. The overall point here is just that this metric, if you just look at the operation of the grid and you say, what is the emission, what is the generation that would serve an additional unit of load, but you can't build anything new. If that's your question, it's going to look like a lot of natural gas and coal, and it's going to be a relatively highly emitting mixture. But that's not the complete story of how we would respond to changes in load, because we would tend to build more stuff. And when we say build more stuff in the current environment, we mean build wind and solar. If you don't take that into account, you have the potential to overestimate the emissions induced by an intervention. So I spent a lot of time to kind of lay the groundwork of what we're looking at here. So hopefully we can move a little bit faster through some of the other metrics here.
Peter, I got a question that might be relevant real quick.
Yeah.
Eric Wilson just asked, how far in the future is this plot on slide 16? And would the short-run marginal emission rate agreement be better if projections were only a few years into the future here?
Yes, thank you, Eric. I meant to say that, but I forgot. So this, the values that we're looking at here, we're looking at an intervention that lasts 20 years. The short-run marginal emission rate and the average emission rate are in the plot that we're looking at right here, calculated just from the values when the intervention was first introduced, which is 2024 in the study that we did. We're going to have an image later where both of those values are also calculated from projected futures over a 20-year time frame. The reason why we're looking at this one first, where it's just looking at the value when the intervention was first introduced, is because that's what would happen in practice. If you go and try to make a decision based off of a short-run marginal emission rate right now, you're going to go and grab a data set from the way that the grid looks right now, and you're going to use it to inform your whatever decision you're trying to make. There's very few instances where people have actually projected this stuff out far into the future. However, it does perform better in that, so we do have a figure. I'm going to show it later. So this is a little bit more like how people would actually presumably use the metrics right now. And then we have the more generous interpretation coming up in a few minutes. So my apologies for not mentioning that earlier. So average emission rate. This is that just looking at what is out there on the grid right now and trying to use it to estimate what emissions would be induced by an incremental change in load. And the first thing that we can see is that the mean error is less than the short run marginal emission rate. At least the degree to which each dot is off of the parity line is less, but it's not doing a good job of capturing diurnal trends. And if we look here, I'm going to do another one of these things where we're looking at one point. It's the same point that it's the same intervention that we were looking at before, just adding load across all hours of the day. We can understand what's actually going on here, which is that we have the same observed mixture, coal, natural gas, some of the other, and wind and solar. But then the average emission rate, because it's looking at everything that's currently generating on the grid, has a different mixture. It's got some nuclear generation and some hydropower in there, because those are a big part of our grid right now, as well as coal, natural gas, and wind and solar. And what we can see by comparing these two things is that the average emission rate, you could say, this is not the most precise way of saying it, but you could say it's right for the wrong reasons. Again, that's not actually a precise way of thinking about it, but if you look at, for this one specific thing that we're looking right here, the nationwide analysis that we set up for this study, there's different places and times and grids that would be different than this, which I'll get to in a sec. But for what we did right here, the fact that the average emission rate, a current description of our grid, has certain non-emitting generators, coal and hydro, but less wind and solar than we expect in the future, are two things that are wrong in opposite directions, and they sort of cancel each other out. So the average emission rate is actually, on average, not a terrible projection of the emissions that are induced by different interventions in the modeling that we did. But this isn't necessarily a generalizable conclusion. If you went to a different grid, even just like a smaller region in the US, you might not see this phenomenon. It might be quite a bit different, or an entirely different grid outside of the US. So for our specific condition, it had less average error than the short run marginal, but it was mostly by happenstance, essentially. And understanding mechanics of how it can misfire is important for kind of understanding whether or not it might be suitable for a particular purpose. Then the last one that I have here, the last of the three metrics that we're looking at, is the long run marginal emission rate. This is the one that is built from a projection of the future, so we would expect it to perform better. And it does perform better than the other ones, but not perfect. It still doesn't totally follow that parity line. So just to walk through, this is important to illustrate because it kind of it's a limitation of our study that is illustrated by this. I'm going to look at the same intervention that we were looking at for the other two. We're just adding load across all hours. Because this intervention is the same as the intervention that we use to calculate the long run marginal emission rate metric, it's perfect. It exactly anticipates what is going to happen with the intervention. This is obviously never going to happen in reality. This is a description of how well this metric could perform if the future unfolds exactly as you expected it to, which is never going to happen. In this paper, we didn't look at that type of uncertainty, but in the data products that we release and make available to people, this Cambium data set that we're going to mention at the end, we project out multiple different futures. There's 5 different futures that we have right now. We'll continue to update and re-release new data going forward. And we always tell people, you really want to take into account how the future can deviate from what you expect and build that into your analysis. We didn't look at that here. This is just looking at how well can these metrics perform if you are even just correct in your anticipation of how the grid will unfold. All of these metrics, any type of projection of the future, is always susceptible to that kind of fundamental uncertainty that the future might look different than you did. It's important. We're not going to talk about it more here now, though. I'm just going to go through this stuff real quick. I wish that we could go through all these different points. There's a bunch of interesting mechanics here of what's going on. We just don't have the time. But real quick, I'm just going to point out that the long run marginal emission rate, even though it's built from a projection of the future, can still be wrong because it is built off of a certain prototypical intervention, we scaled up load by 5% across all hours. But then if you're using it to estimate a different intervention, this one here that I've highlighted over here is adding load predominantly during the nighttime. It can be wrong. Adding load just during the nighttime can be different than what the nighttime hours looked like when you added load across all hours. If that doesn't make sense, don't worry about it. It's just trying to say that the LongRun marginal emission rate, because of intra-hour effects, there is some ability to capture the diurnal trends in different interventions, but it is not perfect. If you really want to be able to get a clear vision of a particular shape intervention, you got to go and run the models, or at least that's, it's still going to be only as good as the models are, but at least it's the only way to get around the fact that there's a dependency between hours that is not really possible to capture completely in a priori metric that you're just saying, here's this hourly description of emission rates. Real quick, I'm just going to flash these up on the screen. Don't have time to go in them. In daytime interventions, the LongRun marginal emission rate was wrong in the opposite direction. It overestimated the emissions induced when we plugged it into the full models. And then here we have this negative one. This is super interesting. It's if you add load during the hours that are really good for solar, you can have spillover effects. You can essentially induce more solar than just your intervention and actually end up having a negative emissions impact. I would never, our ability to project that's actually going to happen for a specific intervention is always going to be questionable because of that uncertainty about the future. So I wouldn't necessarily, try to target something specifically like this, but it's just interesting to see that there are types of interventions that can actually induce things to be built that results in a net reduction in emissions from the power sector. And that's kind of explored a little bit in this paper. I got to keep moving. I mentioned Eric had a question about the time frame that was being assumed for each of these metrics. Like I said, everything that we just looked at, the short-run marginal emission rate and the average emission rate, were just calculated from the year that the intervention was introduced. It'd be very fair to say, well, could they perform better if they also looked forward over the 20 years of the intervention that we assumed? Nobody does that right now in practice, but if we did, would that be better? And if we did that, it looks like this. So first thing you can see is that it does improve the performance of both of these metrics. The short run generally decreases. The average emission rate, the typical magnitude is about the same, but it kind of bends upwards a little bit and starts to be able to anticipate the diurnal trends. However, neither one of them improve enough to outperform the LongRun marginal emission rate. That's because mechanically they are still omitting things. For example, the short-run marginal emission rate still omits the structural response, even if you integrate it over time. This is actually super important. When I started this work several years ago, I thought that integrating the short-run marginal emission rate over the lifetime of an intervention would describe the impact of that intervention. And through this work, I have found out that that was not correct. Because if you do that, if you integrate the short-run marginal emission rate over the lifetime of the intervention, you're still missing how that intervention could influence structural decisions. And because structural decisions are building new wind and solar, it has this effect of missing the inducement of new clean generation. It's very important. I didn't know this when I first started this work. If there's one thing that you should take away from this, it's that effect. It's very important to understand where it's appropriate to apply these things. Okay, I'm going to run through quickly here just the kind of takeaways from what we just talked about. So real quick, short-run marginal emission rate. It does not comprehensively reflect the consequence of intervention. It's just describing the immediate operational impacts. It doesn't capture the structural impacts of whatever you're doing, if they'll happen. In our study, it often significantly overestimated induced emissions. That doesn't necessarily always have to be the case. In other grids, you could have something different, but in our study, that's what we saw. And then the third bullet point under short run is what I was just talking about. Integrating the short run over time does not fully capture the consequences of an intervention. Very important. Average emission rates. The mean error was less than the short run metrics, but it was mostly by happenstance for the particular situation that we're looking at. It's not a generalizable conclusion. It also did not do a good job of capturing diurnal trends well in our nationwide analysis. Mostly that's because it lags behind. If you go to a place that already has a bunch of solar and is also planning on building a bunch of solar, it would probably perform better for this. It would be able to see that you've built a bunch of solar and that become embedded into your expectations of what would happen in the future. But if you haven't done that yet, then you can't anticipate something that you haven't already done. Average emission rates lag behind, which is why it's important that they're in this time of evolution, lagging behind what we're expecting to do in the coming decades. Then lastly, LongRun Marginal emission rate in the modeling environment that we did here, it was able to outperform the other two metrics, but it still wasn't perfect. A lot of caveats that I have on the next slide. So first, I probably should have started, should have had this earlier. I didn't know how to fit it into the narrative here, but this first bullet point, in the study that we did, we assumed that the interventions were expected and planned for. That's appropriate for some situations. If you have a large energy efficiency campaign, if you have something that's like a renewable generator that's actually like in a queue and the resource planners know about it. A bunch of different things would be expected, and you could assume that the structural response of the grid would come online at about the same time that the intervention would be. But there's also many, many interventions that are not expected or they're not planned for. If you're just doing something, if you're just like electrifying, your hot water boiler or something like that, it's not like you told anyone about that ahead of time. And for those interventions, it is almost certain, we haven't formally studied this, but it's almost certainly better to have a combined short run and long run marginal emission rate metric that basically says that if you do something unexpected to the local resource planners, the people buying and selling assets in the grid, that there's going to be an immediate response that is short run, that is operational only, and then it's going to take some years, 3, 4, 5 maybe, before it structurally induces change in the grid. So some type of combination of those two things is probably going to be important for lots of different interventions. We didn't do that in this study. Real quick, I talked too much. I want to finish up. I only have a couple more slides, 2 slides here, then we're going to go to questions. You should always say, anytime you're projecting the future, the metric that comes out of that is only as good as the underlying model. Very important. Don't go too overboard with this long-run marginal emission rate stuff. Understand that it's a projection of the future from a model, and models are always going to be imperfect. We have to work through that as a community together, where these things are good enough to apply to certain decisions. We also only were talking about these like a priori assessments of these 20-year interventions. But I just wanted to flag that everything that we talked about here today, this importance of structural change in response to an intervention, likely applies to real-time operational decisions as well. Essentially, if you're deciding when you want to charge your electric vehicle today, you should probably take into account, this work suggests that it would be reasonable to take into account not only the immediate operational impacts of that decision, but also how it could influence later structural decisions. If you charge your electric vehicle during daylight hours, you create a little bit more demand for daylight electricity. And because solar is so cheap right now, in places where it has a good resource, it's not cheap everywhere. But because in places with good solar resource, it's relatively cheap, it would be reasonable to expect that your behavior could help to induce in later years the investment in more solar resources, or at least that's the notion that this study that we've done here is suggesting. Again, a lot of good debate about this stuff happening. We only looked at carbon, but the concepts here apply to other greenhouse gas emissions like methane and nitrous oxide, as well as the other criteria pollutants as well. We just didn't do that in this study. Limitations, real quick. Sorry, this is a boring slide. Just text. Our scenarios had relatively little curtailment compared to some places that you can see right now. Curtailment was happening about 1% at the time. And often that was happening in locations with relatively little load. So then when we go and aggregate things up, it has relatively little impact. The short-run marginal emission rate might perform a lot better where there's a significant curtailment. Places like California right now, certainly just the idea that there's a good correlation between curtailment and later structural change means that there's a good reason to believe that that the short-run marginal emission rate might perform better if you like looked at a smaller region that had lots of curtailment. And then real quick, we only looked at our mid-case projection in the future. If you assume more aggressive decarbonization scenarios, either because things are cheaper, because there's policy support, then the longer marginal emission rate actually performs even better, and the other ones perform worse just because there's a more aggressive change, which you have to look forward to anticipate. And then the other two things I've already talked about. We only looked at the future unfolding as expected. We're ignoring this other kind of deeper uncertainty that's always present, but it's important to consider, and you should do scenario analysis if you're really working with this stuff. And then we also examined only the nation as a whole. A lot of interesting stuff happening at local levels. Didn't mean to dismiss that, just had to do something for this paper. Last thing, I was going to bring up here, I'm not going to bring these things up. I just want to say we have this, there's this broader project, the Cambium project that this paper was part of. And one of the things that this is producing is we're annually releasing data sets that contain hourly emissions, costs, and operational metrics for modeled futures of the US electric sector. So it is, each of the metrics that we talked about here today are available in this data set, as well as a bunch of other useful metrics that we didn't talk about. And here, if you want to see, we'll just be updating we'll have a website for this project, the Cambium project, nrel.gov/analysis.cambium. You can go there and look in the future for updates. But then we also have, if you want to act on this long-run marginal emission rate data, we have these Excel workbooks that we've put together to help with that. If you follow the link here, that you could get to those workbooks. There's also a scenario viewer and data downloader where you can actually see the projections of the future that we have that are underlying this data, as well as downloading all of the data that I've mentioned that are in this data set. That's that scenarioviewer.com or scenarioviewer.nrel.gov. And then if you're active in this space or you have any questions, just reach out to me. We're engaging with the community on this to better understand what people are applying this data to better support future products. And that's all I got. So Matt, how do you want to do this? Were you going to call out questions? Do you have questions?
I think we got a couple good, we got 3 wonderful questions right here. So if you want to look at them, do you have the Q&A pulled up? I could read them to you if not.
Yeah, I guess I can. Okay, so I have,
so I can read them aloud as you read them in your brain. It's up to you.
Yeah, I'm just going to read them off and I'm reacting to these in real time. So we had one question, which is from Elena.
She said that you answered that. Just
oh,
FYI,
I did.
But
okay.
You could cover it if you want.
Yeah. Did you use the same? My apologies. Sorry, this is inelegant. I'm reading these in real time, which I'm discovering is not that good. I'm going to go to Robert's question. If we add load across all hours, wouldn't that induce typical baseload generation in the grid rather than renewables? Yeah, and I didn't talk about this stuff in more detail. I wish I had time to go into it. I made it sound like, now I'm thinking in retrospect, that renewables were the only thing that was being built by adding load across all hours, and that wasn't the case. There was also like natural gas units being built in response to that. The coal generation, like if we go back to the those mixtures here. So like this is the observed mixture, this coal generation, that's not new coal being built, it is an increased utilization or a delay of retirement of existing coal plants. The natural gas generation was a part of the same thing, but we'd also occasionally see additional natural gas being built. And then there's also this stuff being built. So it's really this big mixture of some things being delayed retirement, some things being newly built, and some things just existing or increased utilization of existing generators. And the point of these metrics is it kind of combines all of that into this one mixture and is based on that. So hopefully that answers your question. I have another one here about the negative CO2 emissions rate. Well, hopefully I did touch on that. I'm going to speak just a little bit more about that. I don't know, if you don't work with these models, this might land flat, but I'm just going to try to very quickly explain what could go on here. If you took a new load, a dispatchable load, like an electric water heater, electric vehicle, or any industrial process that you can shift around, whatever, data centers, and you added a lot of load in hours that are, for example, ideal for solar, you can help boost up the value of solar, especially if you have the ability to take something where there was curtailment and you're flipping it over, that's spilling, you have basically too much electricity, curtailing solar electricity. And if you can change that to being no longer curtailment, then the value of electricity in those hours goes up a lot. And you can change the economics such that you end up building another solar power plant, for example. And then because you built this thing that generates at all hours that are sunny, it can actually influence hours beyond just the ones where you added load. And you can end up offsetting other generation types in hours where you were not adding load, to the point, to the end result that you end up having a net negative change in the emissions from the power grid as a whole. That's really hard to capture because it's this like inter-hour effect. You're doing one thing in 1 hour, which has spillover effects because of what it causes investments to change into other hours. It's really hard to capture in these types of metrics, which is why none of the metrics were able to anticipate negative emission rates. Super complicated thing. Being able to study this area, I think there's going to be more work in that area in the future. Yeah, I don't know. Hopefully that helped. I don't know. Maybe it didn't. All right. I am going to go to the next. Matt, sorry, are you trying to say something? I see. It says Matt Irish would like to answer this question live. Is that?
Oh no, sorry. I just I enabled that and then just hit done. I'm just doing some accounting for you.
Okay.
You answered it live.
So we've got a question from Kara here, which I'm trying to read in real time. So we derived the metrics. So like this, the LongRun marginal emission rate, these heat maps here are derived from a prototypical load. We just have to pick something to perturb our models with to generate these values. We did a 5% scalar increase in load. And Kara here is asking how much does that matter? Like if we had done a 1% perturbation of load or a 10%, like how much would these metrics change if you had different size interventions? And the correct answer is that we haven't formally studied that. I haven't done like a full analysis where I sat down and rigorously did different perturbations and looked at how these changed across different size interventions. We have done some relatively informal analysis where I did exactly that, where we had a range of perturbations from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 all the way up to 20%. And there was definitely differences. You see differences in what kind of mixture underlies this. The bigger the intervention, the less you're drawing from existing resources for the most part. But I wouldn't consider it to be dramatically different. The overall magnitude is fairly similar, and you still get this sunspot thing of adding load, of load in being in the middle of the day, tending to have less emissions because of the effects of solar. For those of wondering, wind is here. It doesn't have as dramatic of a diurnal profile, so it kind of lowers emissions across all hours. But wind is part of these projections. Anyway, so Kara, I don't want to mislead and say that I've done like a really formal analysis of how much does this change with the size of the intervention. That work has yet to come, but the initial explorations that we've done of that have at least been encouraging that this stuff is not wildly unstable with the intervention size. The basic question of what is the least cost solution subject to operational and policy constraints for a 1% increase in load versus a 5% increase in load is a relatively stable answer. You still get a fairly similar mixture. Is battery storage on the grid part of the model? Yes. Is the amount of storage significantly increases? Yeah, so we have storage is part of these projections, and we have to kind of unwind the influence of storage when we're calculating all of these different types of metrics. If you're getting storage power in the middle of the day, you have to figure out where that storage got its power from. to be able to really trace the ultimate consequences of your actions. It's actually super complicated. Put a lot of work into kind of unwinding the effects of storage that are in these models. We also have some models that we have different projections of the future with different costs of storage. So we have some understanding of how the level of storage can influence what we're looking at right here. It matters. It doesn't dramatically change the narrative of this specific thing, the emission rates. Mickey, is it fair to say the difference between average emission rates in your model and the long run marginal emission rates is that you're assuming with average emissions that today's mix is the remaining the same over the next 20 years and the long run is changing? Nope, it's not just that. It would be that kind of perspective is more true for this specific image right here, because the average emission rate in this particular thing, we just said estimate a 20-year intervention with what the grid looks like right now. But if you projected forward over the 20 years and were exactly right about that and made your choices based off of that, it would look like this. So it's better. You can see how it's a little bit better than this. This average emission rate in this example that we have here perfectly anticipated how the grid would respond, would evolve over time. It still is just not, at the end of the day, a description of what currently exists is not the same thing as saying what is the next thing that you would build or use. It's not always building. What is the next thing that would, what is the generation mixture would serve the next unit of power? Those are not the same questions. So even if you project forward in time, you're not going to get a perfectly correct answer. Okay, I have another question from Elena here. Are there other major capacity expansion power sector models? Have we looked into testing them with other models? Is how I'm interpreting this question. There's definitely other major capacity expansion models, like the EIA has one NIMS that they use for the annual energy outlook, for example. A bunch of groups have like the groups like the CPUC works with E3 and a bunch of other consulting groups in California to do capacity expansion modeling in their region. They produce their own results. There's a lot of work in this space of different research groups that have different projections of the future. As far as there's the California stuff that is calculating long-run marginal emission rates. As far as I know, no other group is working on calculating these different these like long-run marginal emission rate metrics from different models. I would love it if they did, because it would be great to see how other research groups would also approach the same, creating the same metric. It's just relatively new, so as far as I know, they haven't started that yet. I have another question here. Regarding the negative observed emissions, is it that PV has a negative emission rate, or because PV, or because of, I'm gonna answer what I understand is the intent of this question. It's not that PV has a negative emission rate. Certainly, if you take into account, which we don't here, but if you take into account the embedded carbon from the creation of the devices and the pouring concrete and whatever, it would induce emissions by building new stuff. We don't look at that here. We don't have that type of emission represented in these analyses. We might do that in the future, but we don't have it here. But even what we have is it's just a zero emitting resource. It's not like PV is taking carbon out of the air. So the way that it creates negative emissions is just that if you have an intervention that induces a bunch of PV to be built, more PV than you needed for that specific intervention, then it can kind of have these spillover effects that can end up having a net decrease in power sector emissions, which mathematically then is a negative emission rate for that intervention. It's basically saying if you have a base scenario and you have a perturbation and the emission rate in the perturbation is lower, then whatever you did, whatever that perturbation was, had a negative emissions impact. and the way that this happens here is that you build enough PV that there's this spillover effect. So hopefully that makes sense. Well, we're basically at time. We've got 4 minutes left, and that was the last question that I'm seeing. So yeah, if there's anything else, if you want to throw it into the Q&A box now, I'll just answer this stuff as it comes in. But if not, I'm not seeing anything else coming in. So thanks for your time, everyone. And again, if you're active in this space, either if you create this data and you want to talk about something that we talked about here today, or if you're using this data and you want to talk about that stuff, reach out to me. Pieter.Gagnon at NREL.gov. So, all right. Thanks for your time, everyone. I think we'll. Oh, how do different short-run emission estimates compare? I don't have. We didn't do that as part of the there's. I assume that you're referring to the fact that there's like avert modeling, watt time, resurety, Carbonera, electricity map, all these different things. I've never done a comparison of the different estimates of the short-run marginal emission rates. There's overall, both in my own work, I'm going to call myself out for this, as well as other people's work. I would say we need to be more transparent about what we're doing. There's not a lot of validation is always going to be too strong of a word for this kind of stuff that involves projecting the future, but more transparency on our underlying models and just publicly available data set. A lot of the stuff you need to go and pay for and stuff like that to do comparison analyses, and people have done a lot of their own validation of their methods, but then not written about it, which is just for something that is important, as important as this is. You know, overall, it'd be good for all of us to be doing more of that, me included. Oh yes, sorry. Eric Wilson has reminded me that that there is an upcoming paper from some of my colleagues in our residential buildings research group here at NREL, Elena Present and Eric Wilson and a bunch of other folks there who have done some, there's a conference paper where we've done a lot of comparisons of different types of metrics for different types of building interventions, like efficiency measures, different things like that. So if you want to see how different mission metrics can change your answer, there'll be a paper coming out, this ACEEE paper. Look for Elena Present and Eric Wilson, or contact one of us. I don't have the name or know how to tell you how to get it, but it'll be available at some point. All right, I'm going to hang around for just like 2 other minutes in case anything else comes in, but I think we're probably done here. So thanks everyone.